Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and I'm excited to bring you a recommendation video for vampire books. And if you've been following my channel for a while, you might be surprised because I constantly say that while I love horror, I don't love vampire books. But yet somehow I was looking at my list on Goodreads and I realized that I probably had enough videos to do a follow-up video on this topic. I've actually done this once before, so I'm going to have that link down below and in the cards if I remember. But basically, this is a list of vampire books that I think do not suck. I am very selective, I'm very picky when it comes to the genre, but these are ones that really stood out above the rest, often because they are a little bit different, a little bit unique, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of these as well, hopefully add a few new things to your radar. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is the updated Tor Nightfire edition. In this story, we follow a street rat named Domingo who ends up getting pulled into living with this vampire. Within this version of our world, vampires exist, but what is different about a lot of the stories that I see is that in this case, people are aware that vampires exist. It's not some dark secret. Instead, people are aware of them and just happen to treat them like second-class citizens. So I like that this is a vampire story, but it also makes a lot of criticism or social commentary on how we treat those that are other or different, and we often don't treat them well. This is a book that I mostly love for the pieces of world building, the atmosphere, the unique cultural elements, bringing in that Mexican representation within the story. As for the story and plot itself, I will admit it's a little bit quieter, slower pace. It's much more about the characters and not a whole lot happens in it. But despite that, which is not always my thing, I tend to love more plot-driven narratives. I do find this world to be very compelling. I love some of the reasoning and lore behind the vampires and kind of pulling again from Mexican mythology. So if you're interested in this one and haven't checked it out, I do think it's worth giving a try because again, it's very different than a lot of the vampire stories I normally see. Next is Let the Right One In by Ajvide Lindqvist, and this is a translated story that I have really fallen in love with over the years. We follow a young boy who is bullied terribly in school, and one day a new girl moves in next door. She appears to be of a similar age, and they begin to form a friendship. Now within the story, it is very complicated. It's very, once again, character driven, so I will admit that it's less focused on a narrative plot. Instead, you spend a lot more time just with the characters. Given the fact that this book is in this video, you can expect that the young girl that I mentioned is not quite human. She's not quite a girl at all, and so this book actually brings in some interesting queer representation of someone who identifies as perhaps being non-gender conforming, and of course also vampire representation, if that's such a thing. And so I really love the story, but I have to give content warnings that the bullying within the story is absolutely brutal. I read a lot of messed up and disturbing books, but I think because of the fact that the story is just so intimate and so personal, you really get to know these young characters. It was really hard to read on the page of what was happening to them, but at the same time, it's also this vampire narrative. It's complex, it's different, it's unique, it's very well done. And again, if you love character-driven stories, this is one I really recommend picking up. I thought it was very well done and has since become a favorite of mine. I love it a lot, and I hope that you will too. Next, we have The Lesser Dead by Buehlman, and this is a vampire story that is set in historical New York. We follow a man who happens to be a vampire known as Joey Peacock. In this other alternative history, you find out that there are vampires that are living within the tunnels of New York, and we follow this individual man. This is the first person narrative that once again is very intimate, and I really love getting inside the head of this vampire. The story is very gritty, it's very adult. There is a lot of sexual content within the story. Just know that it definitely leans into that aspect of vampire lore. And what I like is that it leans into that without trying to romanticize it. And so this isn't going to be for everyone, but I will say content warning for sexual assault and everything that goes along with that, because you basically have vampires that are using their vampiric powers to control humans and treating them like sex slaves. And the book is not apologetic for it because again, we are reading from the mind of a vampire. And I really like that again, it takes out that kind of romanticism that kind of makes vampire stories really weird. So I like that it addresses it. I love that it's gritty. I think the main character is very memorable. I'm not someone who always remembers a character's name, but Joey really stands out, and he definitely is a character that you won't forget. Overall, I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was very unique, a different setting, and just once again a very good character-driven story, which I'm realizing as I make this list is perhaps what I'm looking for when it comes to vampire fiction. Is I really like when I connect with the character, and that definitely was the case here. Hopefully you enjoy it as well. And if you're open to reading a nonfiction vampire book, I want to recommend Vampires of Lore by A.P. Sylvia. This is a nonfiction book that I read and reviewed a while back, and it's one that's really held my attention. I do tend to read and review more fiction on this channel, but every once in a while a special nonfiction comes along that really just grabs my interest, and that was the case here. I like that this one is quite short, it's very digestible, easy to fly through with short chapters as well. And at the end of each chapter is documentation so that you can see where the author got their research from. The basic idea with this book is that it explores all of the myths and lore that surround vampirism and basically looks for real life situations in the past that would have explained how this lore came to be. So it looks at things like mirrors and garlic and crucifixes and explores how that could have gotten woven into the myth, where it could have come from in terms of history. And I thought it was super fascinating. This book is very gifty, it's very beautiful, it's very well done with like nice artwork. So if you are looking to gift someone who loves vampires, this is a good one to go with. And yeah, it's one that I've returned back to a couple times after reading it, tend to just put books on my shelf, and this is one that I keep pulling out again and keep going back to because I thought it was just so fascinating. Next up is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, and this is a vampire story that follows a young woman who is dying. However, this man comes along who happens to be Dracula and saves her life by making her immortal, and she becomes his wife. This, compared to other books I've described in this list, is more romantic. So this one is a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I wasn't entirely sure how I'd feel about it when I read it. Thankfully, it's very well done, it's very poetic, it's very short. I think a book like this, if it had been twice as long, would have been a bit exhaustive, but I found it to be, again, very beautiful in terms of what it was doing, very slow, character driven, and it just gave a different perspective on Dracula. I love the original story. The only reason I'm not recommending it here is because I'm pretty sure I put it in my original video, which again is linked down below, but it was really cool to see a different perspective on it, a different twist on the mythos and story, and overall it was, yeah, just pretty lovely. Very slow pace, very suspenseful, and a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but sometimes we all need that. Sometimes we always need to stretch ourselves and just try something a little bit different. If you love Gothic romance, I think you will really enjoy this one. And speaking of Dracula, I also read Dracula Ascending, which is a retelling of Dracula that mashes it together with a retelling of Frankenstein. Now, I love Dracula, but I'll admit at the time recording this, I haven't yet read Frankenstein. I don't think you need to in order to enjoy this story, because essentially it's the idea that there is a scientist or inventor that goes about creating or reanimating this monster, but instead the monster that they are reanimating is the origin of how Dracula comes to be. They basically create the first vampire. I thought it was just such a creative idea, and it was very well done. With a story like this, I think it would be so easy to make it campy or cheesy, but instead it felt very authentic. It felt very rich. I love the prose, I love the characters, the writing. Some of the lines just about Dracula and how he was really looking at himself and just coming to accept himself as a monster, I thought were really poetic and had some really nice themes and commentary all around the topic. And I was just, yeah, really surprised. It was such a fun book. If you enjoy either of the classics, I do think that you will enjoy this one as well. It really stands on its own, and I do highly recommend it. Next, I want to talk about Empire the Vampire by J. Kristoff, which is a horror fantasy mashup that follows an alternate history where humanity has been at war with vampires that are starting to create their own empire. And I will admit that this one was not entirely to my taste, but I do think it had a lot of good elements going on with it. Simply, again, I just don't love vampire fiction, but I thought this one was doing a good job with what it was trying to do. It is a very long book, but despite that, I thought the prose was very good. It is well developed with a lot of character focus, and again, I think it's just a little bit different. It's very adult, and it does have a lot going for it. I liked it, but again, these books are really large, so I didn't feel compelled enough to continue on with the series. But if you love vampire fiction more than me, you may want to try this one out for yourself. Next is The Delicate Dependency by Michael Talbot, and this is a story of a father and doctor who is raising his young daughters alone. One day he comes across a man who's been involved in an accident, and he helps this man, actually agrees to take this man home and and care for him until he can get well. This man begins to interact with his daughters, and the story spirals from there. I don't want to give away the plot twist. I think it might even be on the back of the book, but I do recommend going in as blind as possible. Now, this is a book where in some ways it is very tropey, where it does lean into some of the common themes surrounding vampirism, but I also like this book because in a lot of ways it is just as focused about the father-daughter relationship. You find out that one of his daughters has some complications and would be seen as special needs. However, this book is set in the past, is actually historical in nature, and so because of that you get to see how people were treated with disabilities and higher needs within the past. And this book definitely has some interesting or complicated relationships surrounding that topic, and I do think that the author handles it well, where you can see the difference between the characters' perspectives and the author's perspective. So I do think that it was well nuanced, but it certainly leans into the challenges that we didn't really value people with disabilities the way that we do now, or at least the way that we should now. And so I definitely like this book because I thought it had some really challenging commentary. It was really unique and kind of pushing the limit of what you would expect to see in a story like this. And that again is just the beginning of where the story starts, and there's definitely a lot more to the plot that I'm holding back. So if you enjoy vampire fiction or like me don't, this is still a really good character-driven story with some really compelling commentary that I just can't stop thinking about. So highly recommend. And finally, I want to talk about Woman Eating by Kohda. And this is a vampire story that is much more literary in nature than some of the ones I previously talked about. Within the story, we follow a young woman who you find out is, of course, a vampire. And within the story, she is very hungry. As is often the case, she is only able to consume blood, so she cannot consume human meat. And so she is just very, very hungry and is constantly thinking about food but not able to eat it. I often describe this book as being a literary metaphor for an eating disorder. I don't know if the author has suffered themselves, but this book certainly rings true for the experience of being anorexic, the mental hunger that goes along with it. Within the story, you follow the character as they are going grocery shopping, they're looking at food, they're going on YouTube and watching those what I eat in a day videos. And if you are someone who is aware of eating disorders, you know that this is prime behavior. And so I really like that this is a story that, yes, is about vampirism, but it's less horrifying in the traditional sense and more horrifying in the way that we really turn people into these hungry creatures that feel very otherly because of our society norms. And I think this book is just very topical, very nuanced. Again, it's very character focused, so the plot is very slow and is going to be more suspenseful than action-packed. But despite those things, I really did enjoy this one a lot. I thought it was fun and smart, and I do recommend it. All right, so that is it for this video. I would love to know, of the books I talked about, are there any that you're planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd also love to hear in the comments, what is your favorite vampire story, especially if you think it's one that I may not have read. Don't forget, if you are looking for more vampire books that I didn't talk about here, I have a whole nother video on the topic, so if I didn't talk about it here, I might have talked about it over there. So if you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and true crime. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up. You can share it around online with your other vampire fanatics and friends. And if you want to drop a comment, how about we do a vampire emoji? That seems pretty straightforward. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.